You're watching the 2018 Legatus Summit.
Certainly want to thank Megan Frankel for offering us a little good news about healthcare and our faith. You know, one of the unique things about our Catholic faith is that we just don't care about you spiritually. We care about you physically. Your body and your spirit have to work together. And I think there are people in the professional healthcare world who know it, including my own father, a physician who still does, to this day, even though he's 80 years old, house calls. And I got to tell you, I'm just so proud of my dad for being able to stand up for our Catholic faith. And we have to do the same. You know, a lot of people think, gosh, Father Leo, you're a very energetic priest. And people say, where do you get your energy? Coffee, people. That's where it comes from, okay? And so thank God he made this. But I have to also say that I'm more than just a guy who talks about food, although I do love it. And I just simply have to tell you this. Whoever made the bacon this morning, fantastic. Didn't they do a great job? Well, the reality is that our faith, our spirit, works with our bodies. And we need a lot of learning about this, the theology of the body, which is why I'm really proud to introduce longtime journalist Sue Ellen Browder, who sheds much needed perspective on a particular body, a woman's body, on the truth of feminism in modern culture, particularly in her latest book, Subverted: How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement. Ms. Browder, who has appeared on Oprah and on the Today Show, among hundreds of interviews, wrote for Cosmopolitan, New Woman, and Woman's Day, and draws from a lifetime of experience in the women's movement. Her utter delusionment with secular feminism and the sexual revolution and their inherent betrayals ultimately catalyzed her search for truth and peace, guess where? In Catholicism. She highlights the essence of true feminism and reveals how men and women can work together toward an authentic liberation which will genuinely set women and families free. So, to welcome her on the shortest women's march from the back of the stage to this podium, let's, ladies and gentlemen, put a warm Legatus welcome to Sue Ellen Browder. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'm going to talk to you today about my book, but there's two stories in this book. One is my story, my personal story, and it's actually a love story. It's a story about my late husband, Walter, and me as we went on our journey together. And the other story is your story. And the story I want to talk about this morning is your story, because it's your story that has been forgotten. And if you don't tell your story, nobody else will. So to give you a little bit of background, I was born in a small town in Iowa, and I wanted to be a writer. I went to the University of Missouri School of Journalism, where I learned that the people have a right to know. And I was learned to be an honest journalist, okay? Then I went to New York City, and I fell immediately from grace and took a job at Cosmopolitan magazine, okay? It was the hottest women's magazine in the nation, and I was a magazine writer, and I thought, this is the place to be. So when I told all these lies, there were a lot of lies we told at Cosmo. And when I told all these lies to young women about the joys of hopping into bed with all these men, I was a naive young woman from Iowa. I thought this was just the way the world works. I thought, oh, okay, this is how the real world works out here. And it was only after I became a Catholic at 57 that I began looking back and seeing all the damage that those lies had told. Had left us with all the divorces and and abortions and all of the things. And that's when I decided I had to write this book. And it's called Subverted: How I Helped the Sexual Revolution Hijack the Women's Movement. Because you see, when I was sitting at my little blue desk at Cosmopolitan in 1971, I noticed something then that has long been forgotten. I'm sure a lot of you remember this, but the women's movement and the sexual revolution in those days were two radically different movements. Betty Friedan, who had started the women's movement with her book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963, called Cosmopolitan quite obscene and quite horrible. So how did we get to the point where so many young women today think to be free is to go to college, get a great degree, have a fantastic job, and be as sexually free as possible? How did that happen? Well, as I say, I worked at Cosmo for about 20 years, give or take. And then I went on to write for Reader's Digest and a lot of magazines, and I won a lot of prizes. So by this point, I was a good investigative reporter, and I decided I'm going to look into this and see what happened. As late as the year 2000, Betty Friedan wrote, Ideologically, I was never for abortion. She said, motherhood is a value to me, and even today, abortion is not. She said, I believed passionately in 1967, now this is the women's movement talking, as I do today, that women should have the right of chosen motherhood. For me, the matter of choice has never been primarily the choice of abortion, but that you can choose to be a mother. That is as important as any right written into the Constitution. This is the original feminist. Although Betty was Jewish, and she had abandoned her Jewish roots, even though she never really abandoned it. It was always in her heart somewhere. But she was following in the footsteps of Alice Paul and other pro-life Christian feminists who had fought to give women the right to vote. Alice Paul was a Quaker, and she called abortion the ultimate in the exploitation of women. Other suffragists who opposed abortion, as I'm sure many of you know, included Susan B. Anthony, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. What I came to think of as I was writing this book as the family feminist movement, as Betty Friedan originally envisioned it, was very unifying for women in the 1970s. Women of my generation were entering the workforce in droves, and we were finding a lot of injustices. Women were being fired for being pregnant. I was fired for being pregnant in 1970. So we were encountering bad, lower money for the same work. We were in newspapers, help wanted male and help wanted female ads were separately listed, and the help wanted male was all the good jobs, and the help wanted female was all the bad jobs, the low-paying jobs. Many law schools and medical schools wouldn't allow women in. Women were paid less, as I say, for doing the same job. In some states, women weren't allowed to serve on a jury. People forget that. So working women were very unified in wanting to put a stop to all this. But the sexual revolution, when I went to work at Cosmo in the early 1970s, was quite another matter. Just as Hugh Hefner had created Playboy as a sex revolution magazine for men, Helen Gurley Brown had created Cosmo as a sexual revolution magazine for women. She even patterned it after Playboy and actually used some of Playboy's writers. Hugh Hefner actually gave her consultations on how to make Cosmo a sex revolution magazine for women. Helen had a favorite slogan that was embroidered on a little pillow that she kept in her kept in her office. And the slogan was, "Good girls go to heaven, bad girls go everywhere." And that said it all. At Cosmo, we turned all traditional values upside down. It was good to live with your boyfriend, good to sleep with a married man, good to take the pill, good or at least necessary to have an abortion to get ahead. And all of this in the 1970s, and then certainly in the 1960s, came as a shock to most Americans. If a lot of women were jumping into bed with all these men on the first or second date and having these really wild sexual adventures, they certainly were not talking about it. And that's why when I got that job at Cosmo in 1971, I learned that most of those stories were completely made up. These women just didn't exist. So here's an example. A young woman goes to Paris. She meets a man on the Champs-Élysées. They fall in love at first sight. They tumble into bed, and the next day she knows she's in love. I made up that story. That woman did not exist. But those were the kinds of stories that Helen Gurley Brown wanted in her magazine, and she paid very well. There were a lot of journalists. Time Magazine, I knew a journalist from Time Magazine that wrote for Cosmo. There were a lot of journalists that wrote for Cosmo and made up those stories. The sexual revolution was built largely on propaganda, half-truth, selected truth, and truth out of context. Propaganda isn't just a bunch of lies. Propaganda has some truth, and that's what makes it so subtle. And you know, heresy is also partial truth. So the propaganda is partial truth about the world. But truth and goodness and beauty unite. And what does error do? It divides. It breaks people apart. Evil breaks us apart. So at Cosmo, we split sex from love. If sex is fun, if it feels good, do it. We split men from women. We split babies from women. We split marriage from sex. Helen taught that hard work and sex without the kids will set you free. And that was the key of the sexual revolution. It had to be sex without the kids. According to the sexual revolution philosophy that we promoted at Cosmo, a woman could be anything she wanted to be. She could be a lawyer, she could be a doctor, she could be an engineer, she could be a man. But two things that she could not be was a virgin and a mother. Now, who is a virgin and a mother? Our Lady. So the sexual revolution, I've been going deeper and deeper into this as I think about this. The sexual revolution was an attack on Our Lady. It was an attack on the Catholic Church, the motherhood of the Catholic Church, and it was an attack on Our Lady. A spiritual attack. A woman's freedom depended on not having children. It was an anti-motherhood movement. We will never fully understand the sexual revolution and the Cosmo philosophy unless we see that it was and is a spiritual attack. It is specifically a spiritual attack on the motherhood of the church and an attack on Our Lady. I can't stress that enough. Now, as I was already married, happily married, and I had a child when I went to work for Cosmo, so I didn't buy into all this stuff. I didn't buy into this Cosmo lifestyle. I knew we were lying about it, and I didn't live that way. What I didn't know was that behind the scenes, even before I'd arrived in New York City, the abortion right and the sexual revolution's false promise that sex without the kids will set you free had already been inserted into the feminist movement, largely due to the influence of one man I had never even heard of. His name was Larry Lader. I'll bet, unless you've heard me on EWTN or somewhere, I'll bet you haven't heard of Larry Lader either. Lader was a very successful magazine writer in New York City. He was a Harvard graduate, he was an ardent population planner, and he was the biographer of Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger. His greatest passion was to make abortion legal. And here's the tipping point. He was good friends with Betty Friedan, who had founded the feminist movement. And Betty Friedan, by this point, was the president of the National Organization for Women. Later tried for years to convince Betty. Now this is all stuff that I dug out as I was writing this book, but also a lot of this came from Dr. Bernard Nathanson. If Bernie hadn't told us what had happened behind the scenes, we would never know this story. So we're building this story on what Catholics have told us in the past. So later tried for years to convince Betty that women needed abortion to be free, and she didn't buy it. So, and he actually founded the National Abortion Rights Action League, which is now NARAL Pro-Choice America. Larry Lader and Dr. Bernard Nathanson worked together to found that organization. So but there was a night when Betty Friedan inserted abortion into the women's movement's Bill of Rights. How did he convince her to do that? Well, we don't know all the things he said to her. Remember, they were pretty good friends. But we do know one thing. He wrote a book. He wrote this book. It's called Abortion. And this is a masterpiece of propaganda. Half-truth, selected truth, and truth out of context. Listen to the subtitle of this thing. Abortion, the first authoritative and documented report on the laws and practices governing abortion in the United States and around the world, and how, for the sake of women everywhere, they can and must be reformed. He wrote this book before abortion was legal all over America. He wrote this book in 1966, I think, 66. Anyway, Betty Friedan was convinced that she actually wrote a little blurb on the back of it saying that this was the most wonderful book. So she was convinced by his arguments in this book. But again, these arguments are not, they're full of false claims, half-truth, selected truth, and truth out of context, full of false statistics, but she bought it. So that's one thing she did. We actually do know, we don't know exactly what he said, but we do know the night that it all happened. It was on November 18th, 1967, in the Chinese room of the Mayflower Hotel in in Washington, D.C. It took me 4 years of hard investigative reporting to find out even the date that this happened. But I finally found it, and I actually found the minutes of the meeting. But it happened on November 18th, 1967, in the Chinese room of the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C., that about 100 feminists met for the National Organization for Women to draw up their political Bill of Rights. This is the political Bill of Rights that is still guiding the feminist movement today. Okay, this was in 1967. They voted on 8 rights that day. 6 were unanimously accepted and were things most of us would agree with. One was mother's right not to be fired for being pregnant and not to lose her benefits when she got pregnant and to have paid maternity leave. Another called for the right of working parents to deduct home and child care expenses on their tax returns. Pretty reasonable stuff. Another called for a woman's right to be educated to her full potential. Only 2 rights stirred up on any controversy in that meeting. Now, there's only about 100 people here. One was a call for the Equal Rights Amendment. The ERA has failed. That one is now history. The other right that created an absolute uproar that night among those feminists in that room was the call to repeal all abortion laws. Betty sprang the abortion vote on everyone as the last right to be discussed, and she created an uproar. The scene is very dramatic. I can't do it justice here, but it's all in the book. It was wild. Students were shouting slogans. A huge fight raged until almost midnight, and after that dust settled, the result was that only 57 people, a mere 57 people, voted that night to insert abortion and contraception into the women's movement. approximately 1/3 of those National Organization for Women members walked out of that meeting and later resigned over the abortion vote. These were fervent feminists. At that very hour, the once united women's movement, because it was united, we all believed in all of this other stuff, but the once united women's movement split into two factions: feminists who were for abortion and feminists who opposed it. And truth unites. Truth and beauty, goodness unite. And what does evil do? It breaks people apart. It divides people. That divisive plank number 8 is the only right in the National Organization for Women's Political Bill of Rights that we're still fighting over today. And why? Because that divisive right was inserted through deception and error, largely through the efforts of one man named Larry Lader. But after that big fight in the Chinese room, no reporter was present. It was a closed-door meeting. I'm the first reporter that ever looked into this, okay? But after that fight in the Chinese room, all this was glossed over. The fight was glossed over. And it was all sold as a package to the American people. On Monday morning, Betty Friedan holds a press conference. And a press conference, by the way, is a pseudo event. It's invented. There is no such thing as a press conference until somebody calls it, okay? So she calls a press conference and she hands out a press release in which she claims to be speaking for every working woman in America, when in fact she was only speaking for 57 people and herself in the Chinese room. And that's how propaganda works. The next day, the Washington Post, remember they weren't there, they run a story, they headline the abortion vote and report, now supports the furthering of the sexual revolution of our century by pressing for provision of contraceptives and by urging that all laws penalizing abortion be repealed. As this story came to be fired over and over into American minds by the media, many Americans came to believe that all women wanted abortion to be free. One feminist, ardent feminist in that Chinese room who didn't vote for abortion was Ohio attorney Betty Boyer. Now, nobody's heard of her either. I was in Cleveland. She was a Cleveland attorney. I spoke to a Cleveland Right to Life's group. Nobody'd heard of Betty Boyer, but she was very, very influential. She was furious over the abortion vote. She said, a human life is a sacred trust. Boyer later resigned from NOW after what she called a shouting match, and she went back to Ohio, where she founded the Pro-Life Women's Equity Action League, WEAL. Has anybody ever heard of it? They hadn't heard about it in Cleveland either. WEAL represented a continuation of what feminism was from the beginning. Although WEAL's membership never exceeded 10,000, these women did an enormous amount of good work. The pro-life family feminists who joined Betty Boyer at WEAL opened up academia to women. They forced newspapers to stop running help-wanted male and help-wanted female ads. They worked to get the Equal Credit Opportunity of 1974 passed so a married woman could apply for credit in her own name. Pro-life family feminists at WEAL also worked to get the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 passed, which made it illegal to fire a woman for being pregnant. I'm not saying that WEAL won all these victories single-handedly. They worked with other groups on these same issues. But I do say that pro-life family feminists did a large chunk of the work behind the scenes, and pro-abortion feminists took most of the media credit. Now, I will be honest with you, I talked to Betty Boyer's niece, and she told us why that was possible. Because those at Wheel were very professional women. They were working, and they didn't want their bosses to know they were out there doing this wild, crazy stuff. They didn't want to be running around with placards. So when the liberal feminists, if you want to call them that, the pro-abortion feminists and the sex revolution feminists wanted the publicity, Wheel said, let them have it, let them have it. So, so now, we followed Betty Boyer out of that room, but now let's follow this story a little bit farther. Now along comes U.S. Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun. He's a good old solid Republican from Minnesota. He's a faithful husband, a family man with 3 grown daughters, and Chief Justice Warren, he's new on the court, Chief Justice Warren Burger assigns Harry the task of writing the Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton abortion opinions. Doe v. Bolton is the companion case for Roe v. Wade. Both of them go together. Harry is by far the slowest writer on the court. He's hardly ever thought of about abortion, and he doesn't know what a woman wants. So one evening, he's sitting at his dinner table, having dinner with his wife and his 3 daughters, and he asks all the women around his table what they think of abortion. His daughter, Susan, the youngest, recalled, and this is Susan's recollection, Mom promoted choice, but with some restrictions. Sally's reply was carefully thought out and middle of the road. Nancy was a Radcliffe and Harvard grad, and she sounded off an intellectually leftist opinion. I had not yet emerged from my hippie phase and spouted a far to the left, shake the old man up response. We've all done that, right? Dad put down his fork mid-bite, pushed back his chair, and said, I think I'll go lie down. I'm getting a headache. Well, Harry slaves away at writing the abortion opinions, but it's not going well. He circulates his opinions. His colleagues on the court, his liberal colleagues on the court, slam him. And he withdraws his draft from consideration and vows to try again. Finally, he goes out to the Mayo Clinic in his home state of Minnesota over the summer of 1972, and his $15,000 a year law clerk, 28 years old, George Frampton Jr., stays back in D.C. to help him draft the opinions. Unlike Harry, George is an excellent writer. He was managing editor of Harvard Law Review when he was in college, and in D.C., George comes upon this divisive book. It was written by Larry Lader, and it's a masterpiece of propaganda. The inside dust jacket reads, Larry Lader has written an angry book, but a book completely informed and documented. Documented, right? A book to change the attitudes and laws of a nation. Unfortunately, this completely informed and documented book is laced with poisonous truth, half-truth, and selected truth, truth out of context. And it's also laced with a lot of propaganda, again, false truth, about history, theology, and the Catholic Church. Much of the bogus history in this book was written by a man named Cyril Chestnut Means, a NARAL attorney. The history Means told was so complex and so convoluted, it has taken Villanova University law history professor Joseph Della Pena 1,283 pages in his book, Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History, to sort out all the abortion lies that entered our culture largely through the fabrications of Means and Lader. 1,283 pages. It's so thick I don't carry it on the plane with me. When Harry Blackmun accepts Larry Lader as a reliable authority on abortion history, philosophy, and Catholic theology, when he used this book as the very foundation for the history of abortion in Roe v. Wade, he became, as a blind man, following a blind guide. Later set himself up as an authority on centuries of abortion legal history and also on 2 millennia of Catholic teachings about abortion. And Blackmun and his clerk fell for the ruse. In Harry's Roe v. Wade opinion, Larry's masterpiece of propaganda is cited 7 times, and Cyril Chestnut Means' false and his legal history papers are cited another 7 times. So what did the scholars think of all this? Well, you know, scholars on both the left and the right have said that Roe v. Wade is very peculiar. Virtually every aspect of the historical, sociological, medical, and legal arguments used to support the Roe holdings have been subjected to intense scholarly criticism. In Harvard Law Review, Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe perceptively wrote, "One of the most curious things about Roe is that behind its own verbal smokescreen, the substantive judgment on which it rests is nowhere to be found." It's found here. So let's look at this story one more time and recap what we've seen here. What actually happened? What could it all mean, and what can we do? First, we have to reclaim our true history and tell our story, which has long been suppressed. We need to name, claim, and proclaim that Christians, not Planned Parenthood, not those marching in the streets with their pussy hats, are the ones who speak for the authentic dignity and respect of all women and girls around the world. And it is the pro-life family feminist movement that represents the genuine, authentic feminism of the 21st century. That's right. The early suffragists like Alice Paul were pro-life. Christian feminism is the original feminism that gave us the right to vote. Pro-life family feminism is the branch of feminism that launched the women's movement in the 1960s before it was hijacked by pro-abortion forces in 1967 in the Chinese Room. Pro-life family feminism, embraced by Betty Boyer and Wheel, is the branch of feminism that helped to open up academia to women, forced newspapers to stop running help-wanted male and help-wanted female ads, allowed married women to apply for credit in their own names, and kept women from being fired for being pregnant by lobbying for the passage of the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978. Wheel didn't do this alone, I want to stress that, but they did play a key role in winning these victories for women, and that role has been completely overlooked by the media. By 1979, now listen to this, the National Organization for Women had 100,000 members, and that same year, the National Right to Life Committee, representing your grassroots feminist movement, had 110 times that many, 11 million members. Christian feminists had the interconnected grassroots power in 1979, and we continue to have that grassroots power today. And where does power grow? It doesn't grow from the top down, especially in a democracy, it better not. It grows from the bottom up. We've got the grassroots. St. John Paul II called upon Catholics to create a new feminism. He even called himself the feminist pope. And I believe we're already doing that. I believe that the pro-life movement is the authentic feminist movement of the 21st century. We need to proclaim this story. Second, as Catholics, we need to catechize each other. As long as people within our own church believe a pro-abortion feminism and not a relationship of love with God and others sets a woman free, we've got serious problems. Evangelization begins at home. Third, we need to turn off the lies of the media. We need to turn off the noise. We're all on the only way to oppose the media fantasy world. And this is what Malcolm Muggeridge said years and years ago. He was a BBC broadcaster. The only way to oppose the media fantasy world, and it is all a fantasy in some ways, is by living inside the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The only way to turn off the media fantasy world is with the truth of Christ himself. Finally, we need to humbly pray the rosary every day. This sexual revolution started out as an attack on Our Lady. Mary's humility and smallness always defeats the evil one. We are Mary's army. She is our leader. She is our leader in battle, and with her as our invincible protector, there is no doubt about it. We will win this war. Thank you, my friends.
Please join us for the 2019 summit at the Monarch Beach Resort in Dana Point, California, January 24th through the 26th, 2019.